Hi everyone, this is Mike Fitz, a fellow with Explore.org and the Bear Camps. In just a couple of minutes at the top of the hour, I'm going to be hosting a live play-by-play style broadcast on the Bear Camps to narrate the bear and salmon activity. So please stand by for that. Hi everyone, this is Mike Fitz, a fellow with Explore.org and the Bear Camps in 2018. And in just a moment, I will be hosting a live play-by-play style broadcast to narrate the bear and salmon activity that we see at Brooks Falls. So please stand by. Well, welcome to Brooks Falls in Katmai National Park, Alaska. My name is Mike Fitz, and I am a fellow with Explore.org. I'm also a former ranger at Katmai National Park, so I have many years of experience watching brown bears and salmon at Brooks River, and I'm really glad that Explore.org has been generous enough to give me another opportunity to share my expertise and experiences with everybody. So this is a live play-by-play style broadcast. It's July 31st, 2018, and about 2 p.m. Alaska time. I'm actually not at Brooks Falls at the moment. I am actually at my home, so I'm doing this remotely. But this style of broadcast will be a little bit different than maybe some of the other live chats that you may have tuned in for on the Bear Cams previously. So I won't be monitoring the chat to answer any of your questions directly, but hopefully I'll have the opportunity to answer a lot of the basic questions that you have about the bear behavior, their identifications, and a lot of the other different things that we might be seeing. So this is live footage that you're seeing from Brooks Falls in Katmai National Park, Alaska. So this is unscripted, and hopefully the bears will give us some interesting things to talk about over the next hour. I also have the ability to toggle between different views. So not only do we have the main Brooks Falls cam, but we also have the Falls Low cam, where we get sort of an eye-level view of the river. And I can also look downriver too, and see if there's anything happening down at the mouth of the river. So we could take a look at the lower river cameras, depending on whether there are bears around there. And of course, we might even go underwater too, depending on what the fish are doing. Maybe we'll be lucky enough to see a bear swimming by in this vicinity. So we'll take a look at the underwater camera from time to time. There are many wonderful camera operators that are moving the cams around. So I'm not directly controlling the cameras at the moment. So the camera operators are looking around. So they're going to be panning back and forth, giving us close-ups of different bears, maybe zooming in on some interesting bear behavior from time to time. So I would like to thank them for their participation in making this play-by-play successful. And it seemed like just a week ago, I was actually writing a blog post about how we can expect to see fewer bears at Brooks Falls. It is the end of July, and the sockeye salmon migration period is pretty much over. We still see some salmon jumping at Brooks Falls, and that indicates there's still a lot of fish in the water that are trying to move upstream. But this is about the time of the year where salmon really have stopped their migration, at least for sockeye. They have kind of determined, hey, this is the right place to spawn. I don't need to go, much further. So we can expect to see bears dispersing away from Brooks River to go fish in other areas. However, again, last week we were thinking about that. There's still a lot of bears around. In fact, last night there were probably more bears on July 31st than I think I can remember seeing within my memory. And if you're not familiar with this location, Brooks Falls is located about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska. So it's at the top of the Alaska Peninsula, and it's really right smack dab in the center of Katmai National Park. And we're looking at a young adult male bear in a plunge pool that we like to call the jacuzzi. And this is a bear that's learning to fish in a lot of different locations at Brooks Falls, and he's actually quite skilled for his age. He's about 6 years old right now, and this is number 503. And he's one of those bears that I really love to watch his continuing story. He has a lot of unique features about his story in the past, being sort of emancipated at a very odd age as a yearling bear in its second summer, which isn't typical for Katmai, getting adopted by 435 Holly, who has been on the cameras earlier today, so maybe we'll see her. And then, being emancipated and separated from Holly a second time at more of a normal age. And now we're seeing him transition from his sub-adult years, where he was a juvenile bear, into a young adult and actually being quite successful at it. So he's good at fishing the far pool. He's good at fishing the jacuzzi. We'll see him fishing on the lip of the waterfall. So we're watching, a continuing story of really success in a very tough world with this young bear. Behind him, there are several other bears. It's difficult for me to tell exactly who's sitting near the log there, but it could be a female, number 39. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that's a spot that we've seen her fishing repeatedly over the past week or so. And you can see, a lot of salmon zipping out of the water. So that indicates that there's quite a lot of fish still available for these bears. It's important to note why bears would stop fishing at Brooks River in August, even though there still can be a lot of salmon in the water. Once salmon really stop kind of migrating, Brooks Falls no longer becomes a good place to fish, because if the salmon aren't swimming up the Brooks Falls and really trying hard to get beyond Brooks Falls, they're much less likely to make mistakes, bump into bears, swim into shallow water where they're vulnerable to bear predation. So there's a period of time throughout the month of August where salmon are very dispersed throughout the river, and they remain pretty energetic. They haven't really done much spawning activity yet, and that really zaps their energy. And they're at somewhat low densities. So when you have low densities of fish and also energetic fish, that creates really difficult fishing conditions for bears. So bears will disperse into other areas where salmon will move into smaller creeks and spawn more quickly, so they can feed on the dead and dying salmon or the spawning salmon. So Brooks Falls really presents actually two periods of time where bears can fish for salmon. One in early summer, in late June and July, especially at Brooks Falls, and then one in the fall. So we have these two periods of fishing time to look forward to here. And on the far side of the waterfall right now, it looks like we have number 480 Otis, the oldest adult male that we know of at Brooks River. So he's in his early 20s, probably at least 22 years old. And he's fairly recognizable because of that floppy right ear that he has. There's a couple of other bears that also have floppy ears, so you have to be a little bit careful. But he has a fairly distinctive profile in the way he sits and fishes in that far pool. So he's all the way back up against that far wall. And then the bear that's in the foreground that just caught a fish, I actually don't recognize off the top of my head. And that happens all the time, actually. I will sometimes be in the comments on explore.org, or making a post, or a blog post or something like that, and talking about how we know these bears individually, and that is true for the most part. But there's always bears that I see, especially this year on the cams, where I don't really know much about their life history. They could be a bear that was here in the past, and its physical appearance just changes. But sometimes there are bears that show up that I don't happen to recognize, especially with smaller bears. And it's interesting to watch those bears that maybe you don't recognize, because they can tell you a lot about their familiarity with Brooks Falls, if they've been here before, if they have, if they're familiar with the different fishing areas. That's an indication that they know the river well. They're just even seeing them interact with one or two bears will help you to know whether they're a dominant animal or not. So there's a lot of different interesting aspects to watching bears that you don't recognize. So if you watch the cams and you see bears and you're like, I don't know who that is, that's perfectly okay, because it happens to me more often than I would like to admit. There's also one really handy tool that you can download off of Katmai National Park's website. It's called the Bears of Brooks River, and it's an identification and behavioral guide to these animals. So please download that book if you wanted to get to know these animals just a little bit more. And a contrast in the way that two of these bears are eating their fish. The one in the foreground, able to work through them, strip the skin off very quickly, probably because it's a younger bear. But the one in the background, again, 480 Otis, he's missing teeth. We know he's missing at least 2 canines. I suspect that many of his other teeth are quite worn down because he is an older bear. And that's an ailment that he'll have to work through. Bears in Katmai National Park receive no veterinary care. They receive no supplemental feed. So these are wild animals living the lives of a free roaming brown bear. So missing teeth, cavities, worn down teeth, those are definitely challenges that older bears face. And we can see that in 480 Otis, the way he really tries to use one side of his mouth to eat his salmon. And he's also not nearly as efficient at high grading the fish as a lot of other bears are. And that's a term that high grading means they're looking for the high grade ore. And for them, really, their currency is fat, it's calories, it's sugar. So in salmon, different parts of the fish are more caloric than others. So the brains, the skin, and the eggs contain more fat than other parts of the fish. So well-fed bears will really try to target those areas and maybe leave the fillets that people tend to prefer behind. So 480 isn't nearly as good at high grading anymore as other bears. He still remembers how to do it. He knows those other parts of the fish taste good to him, but those teeth really kind of hinder his ability to select for the fattiest parts. So he's able to still eat, as you just observed, but at the same time, he has to maybe fill his belly with a little more of the less caloric parts of the fish. But he's not, it's not like he's having a poor summer. He's actually gaining quite a bit of weight. And I want to bring up a photo here. And actually, we're just seeing, I might bring up that photo in just a little bit, but we see, looks like an adult male walking into the scene, and that other one just kind of moved quickly out of the way. And that's an interaction that we see probably more often than not, that style of interaction where one bear just happens to avoid another. And this does appear to be number 801. So he's an adult male. He's not a particularly large adult male. He's not small either, but he's not one of the largest bears that we have here at Brooks River. So if we see one of those other bears, maybe we'll be able to compare and contrast his size with others. But certainly he was more dominant than that other bear that was fishing in that same exact spot. And bears, even though they are tough animals and they are equipped with big teeth and long claws that they can use as weapons, they avoid physical confrontation as much as possible. So subordinate bears will frequently just avoid the approach of a more dominant bear. These animals are very intelligent, so it's easy for them to recognize who's who. They remember each other from day to day, over seasons, and even over years. So they don't necessarily have to compete physically each and every time they approach one another. And it looks like the bear that we were watching before in the jacuzzi is now moved into the far pool for a change of pace. And in fact, the jacuzzi right now is vacant. So 503 was sitting in that plunge pool down below Brooks Falls, and now he's moved back over to the far pool. This might be a good opportunity to take a look at a couple of those photos that I was talking about earlier. So we can take a look at 480 in late June. And again, he's the bear eating the fish over against that rock wall. And he's gained a considerable amount of weight since he first arrived back in late June. So he's well on his way to having a very successful season despite the challenges that broken teeth and missing teeth pose for him. And then we also have another bear, of course, we were 503, who has moved back into that far pool fishing right next to 480. And he's also gained a lot of weight. He's shed his fur, like a lot of these bears are doing right now. Their appearance has changed quite dramatically from late June until right now because they're shedding their fur. And bears really have one molt per year, so they shed their fur in midsummer. So their appearance not only changes because they're gaining weight, but also because they're they're growing a new fur coat. And that new fur coat most often comes in darker than the one that they had before. So their fur, for whatever reason, tends to bleach out and lighten as it ages. So when we see bears come back in the spring, they're much, much lighter than when we last saw them in the fall before they went to their den. So this new fur coat for them is much darker than what we saw previously. And one young bear, it looks like, on the far bank here, of course, eating a fish. When there's a lot of fish in the water, it's easier for younger bears to catch their fill. Younger bears really don't need, of course, nearly as much fish as the larger adults. They can get by with just a few salmon per day, at least to break even and gain a little bit of weight before hibernation. Their bodies are small enough that it can be much more efficient for them and nutritious for them to graze on vegetation. So smaller bears can even gain weight on grass, grazing grass early in the season, and that's something that wouldn't really be profitable for a big adult male. In fact, in other parts of North America where bears don't have access to such rich food resources like salmon, the overall maximum body size of bears is probably constrained by the fact that they just can't get enough calories. So in places like Glacier National Park or the Canadian Rockies, where bears are fattening up primarily on berries, they can't grow into a 1,200-pound animal because there just isn't enough food available in the ecosystem. So there's a couple of different factors that allow these bears here in Katmai National Park, these brown bears, to grow so large. One of them happens to be that they're genetically predisposed just to grow big. That's probably in their genes because being bigger allows you to have access to more food resources and mating opportunities. And then also the rich salmon diet that they have allows them to physically grow bigger. We're taking a bit of a wider view of the falls right now. Again, many smaller bears downstream. That's fairly typical. We have looks like a smaller bear fishing right in front of the waterfall. The older bears and the larger bears at Brooks Falls really do facilitate the scavenging opportunities that a lot of the younger bears try for, especially since they either don't know how to fish at the waterfall or they can't compete for fishing spots at Brooks Falls. And we can see, several of those bears right now on the island. One bear moving downstream out of the way. It looked like an approach of another bear. So again, an example of avoidance. Over the last 5-6 years, I've tried to take careful notes of bear interactions at Brooks River. And the majority of the interactions that I have documented happen to be just simple avoidance. So one bear is moving towards another, and the other one sees that. The other bear recognizes that maybe there's a more dominant animal approaching me, and he just happens to get right out of the way. So in our foreground here, it looked like there was one bear that has a fish. There's another bear that maybe wants some scraps. It's not quite willing to challenge the other bear really to steal it, but it might reach in there, try to pull something away. That happens somewhat frequently, where one bear will try to physically intimidate another, but it's not very good at it. Maybe it just doesn't have the technique down, or it doesn't want to really physically engage the other bear. The bear that's eating the salmon, though, is always at a disadvantage in those situations because its mouth is full of food. It wants to hang on to the fish, so it can't use its paws or its jaws nearly as easily as the other bear. Sometimes it looks like bears will beg from one another. Sometimes it looks like bears will share with one another. And bears sometimes will bawl right in another bear's face, like it wants the other bear to give it fish, almost reminiscent of a cub coming up to its mother and wanting to nurse, and it'll make this loud bawling noise. And then sometimes, in those same situations, a bear will walk away and leave some leftover salmon. And I interpret that not necessarily to be the bear sharing fish with the other one, is that the other, but more or less, the other bear is just in the right place at the right time. The one that was eating the fish gets full. It decides, hey, I don't need to eat this whole thing. I'm just going to leave it behind. So it's not necessarily sharing. It's more or less that the other bear is just in the right place to scavenge. So it's more of a scavenging opportunity where they approach another bear, try to get as close as possible, again, without a physical confrontation. One bear in the middle ground of our scene right now. This looks like a 717. This is a young bear, also a juvenile bear still. One of those bears that we like to call sub-adult bears. So they're not quite adults, they're sub-adults. They're not fully physically mature, not sexually mature. And generally those are, the sub-adult bears are bears between 2.5 and 5.5 years old. Again, that aren't physically mature, but they're independent of their mother. And why bears, stand on rocks like that? I'm not quite sure. They often do that from time to time, but I'm not exactly sure why they happen to do that. I think it might be just a little bit more comfortable on their feet. The water is cold. They're very tolerant of cold conditions, but the water is fairly cold. Looks like maybe 503 has moved back into the jacuzzi, trying some fishing there. Bears will move around from place to place at Brooks Falls. Semi-frequently. It depends on the bear. Depends on where it's learned to fish. Some bears, again, are generalists and they can fish all over the place, and it looks like 503 might be tracking in that direction. Some are more or less specialists, and they like to fish one or two locations primarily. 480 Otis, again, on that back wall. Kind of hard to see in the shadow there, but yeah, 480 Otis. He's one of those bears that will fish in just one or two places, but 503 in the jacuzzi right now will fish in a variety of different spots. And downstream of Brooks Falls, we do have a bear moving through an area that we like to call the riffles. This is a shallow area where there's a lot of submerged rocks, a lot of boulders. It's a tougher place for bears to fish. They will try their hand at it frequently, but they do need to often be a bit more active to catch fish in this location. Because as you can see, the salmon have a lot of escape routes in this area. The water is fairly consistently deep down in the riffles area. So bears will sometimes sit in place and try to pounce on a salmon in the vicinity that happens to swim too close. Or they will chase salmon through the river in this location, especially early in summer when they're very hungry. They haven't had a lot of good fishing opportunities. The frequency of bears chasing salmon decreases as the summer progresses because the bears just get more and more well fed as the season continues. It's actually going to be easier for bears to catch salmon coming up in August and September because the salmon are going to be spawning, and after they're spawning, they weaken and die. So the fish may not have as many calories in them compared to what they have right now, but it'll be easier to catch them. So it's a bit of a trade-off for these animals. They'll be able to catch a lot more salmon later in the year, but each individual fish won't be worth nearly as much, at least from a caloric standpoint. Let's see if we get a glimpse of that bear that just caught a fish. It looks like it may have already moved by the falls low cam or it walked underneath the platform to eat its salmon. If you're a smaller bear and you are worried about another bear stealing your fish, you often move to areas where you can eat your fish in a more secure location. So it's not uncommon to see younger bears catch a fish, move out of the river very quickly, go eat it up in the forest, maybe where it's less likely to have that fish stolen. And again, 503 in the jacuzzi. Again, that young adult bear. And a couple of younger bears sitting downstream of him. Based on their size, they look to be, again, sub-adult bears. So those juvenile bears between 2.5 and 5.5 years old. And these, again, more experienced bears at Brooks Falls, they are going to be facilitating sort of the scavenging a lot of these younger bears downstream. So these bears are just waiting very patiently, looking for any salmon that might drift their way. And several other bears standing on the far back, just looking to do the same thing. This is, again, very typical behavior for them. Not only is fishing at the waterfall difficult for these younger bears because they haven't really learned and honed their fishing skills, but they also have to compete with the bigger bears for the best fishing spots. And the force of the water is actually pretty difficult for them to sit or stand in certain places. In fact, to fish in the jacuzzi successfully, you often have to be a fairly big bear. So we're zooming in right now on a smaller bear, fairly blonde. This one looks like it's not too recently removed from its mother, just based on its size. So this could be its first summer on its own. But a bear this size probably would not be able to go into the jacuzzi and maintain a good position there because of the force of the water really wants to shove it out. So when we see a bear like 503 in the jacuzzi, he's again just growing large enough where he can hold his place. But these younger bears have a much more difficult time doing that. It looks like a group of 3 younger bears, again, still standing downstream of the falls. 717 sort of in the middle of the screen. That bear is fairly recognizable because of that sort of a toasted blonde fur color that it has, fairly blonde ears. And then we have two sub-adult bears that look remarkably alike one another. I suspect these are siblings, and rangers and some of the bear monitoring staff at Brooks River suspect, and I think that this could be true, that these two bears that are standing very close to one another are siblings from a litter of cubs that belonged to number 409 Beadnose last year. Last year we saw her with yearling cubs. So if our suspicions are correct, then these are bears that are in their first summer on their own. And here's a photograph that I took of, I think, these two bears earlier. You can see that their coat color has changed. Their ears are a little bit lighter compared to what we see in this photograph. But occasionally sibling bears will spend a summer together. They may go into the same den together in the fall. Perhaps it's more likely, though, that they're going to den and hibernate in separate locations. Bears tend to, it seems like they become a bit more solitary as they age. So younger bears are more prone to play. They're more prone to seek out sort of that socialization. And then we hardly see that at all with larger adult bears. So like a bear like 480 Otis or 747, we don't see those bears play at all. But a younger bear like 503, young adult bears and sub-adult bears, especially when they're well fed, are more likely to seek out those social interactions. .503 is still testing his skills in the jacuzzi. He's caught in several fish today, but not so far during the broadcast. So we'll see if his success rate picks up in just a little bit. And we are about halfway through the broadcast right now. So if you're just tuning in, my name is Mike Fitz, and I am a fellow with Explore.org and the Bear Cams. I'm a former park ranger with Katmai National Park. So I worked at Brooks River as a ranger for a number of years, and now I'm transitioned into working strictly with the webcams and Explore.org. So I'm very glad that they are giving me the opportunity to share my knowledge with everybody. So over this broadcast, I'm not going to be monitoring questions if you're watching on Explore.org or on Facebook Live, wherever you happen to be, but hopefully I'll be able to answer a lot of the basic questions that you have about brown bears here at Brooks River. And it looks like 480 kind of moving out of that far pool. Another bear is in that location, and that looks to be a bear also with a floppy right ear. So that is one of those bears that sometimes we get 480 confused with, but it looks like number 775 moved into that spot, and maybe that I wasn't able to see the whole interaction, so maybe that made 480 uncomfortable, and he decided, hey, I'm going to go try to fish in another location. But again, each bear has its own definition of personal space, just like people, and that varies not only from individual to individual, but between what other bear is close to them. So 480 might be more tolerant of other bears depending on his prior experiences with them. So a very dominant, fairly aggressive bear that he has learned is likely to challenge him. He may be more prone to move away from, compared to a bear that he's learned, hey, is just going to go into this vicinity of me but isn't going to give me much trouble. So you do see that from time to time as well. Bears reacting to different bears depending on their prior experience. And we'll take I think we're going to take a closer look at 755 in the far pool over here. So he's the one who just caught a fish. And again, you can see a floppy right ear. His ears are generally lighter than the rest of his body. And he also, if he picks his head out of the water, to take a breath, we'll see that he has fairly dark eye rings, and that's one of those things that helps me to distinguish him from number 480. But they like to fish that far pool, both of those bears, quite frequently. And just to give you an idea of how he has changed since the beginning of July. Actually, this picture was taken on June 24th. So about not quite a month and a half ago, but over a month ago. You can see he still had his old fur coat at that time, dark eye rings, but blonde ears. And he's gained a considerable amount of weight in that time. So this bear, 755, is a bear that rarely uses the side of the river where the camera is mounted. The camera is mounted on a wildlife viewing platform, and at this time of the day, pretty much guarantee you there's 40 people standing on that platform. That's the maximum capacity of the falls viewing platform. And that can be an intimidating thing for a lot of bears. Some bears just don't ever really get used to the presence of people. They never develop that high level of habituation for people like many other bears do. And 755 is one of those adult males that just tends to hang on the far side of the river anytime people are present. This is maybe what the falls platform looks like for bears standing on the lip of the waterfall, for instance. That sort of white dome that you see in the middle of the platform is the Brooks Falls camera. So just envision yourself for a moment being in the river, being a bear that's not necessarily tolerant of people like 755, and all of a sudden you see this wall of people, but you're very hungry. You want to come down to the river, you want to fish, but that wall of people makes you second guess yourself. So even though people on the platforms are trying to be as benign as possible, it still alters the behavior of some of the bears in the river. So anytime that you're going to Brooks River, do think carefully about how you can lessen your impact on the animals. Not only remaining quiet while you're on the wildlife viewing platforms, but not using flash photography, for instance, and also trying to stay out of the places that bears really do need to feed, such as different parts of the river, for instance. So it's much easier for bears to work around us if we behave in a predictable manner, staying on the trails and also standing on the wildlife viewing platforms. And of course, the falls complex is actually quite big. The boardwalk complex, I should say. So this is a photograph I took from the north side of the river. A lot of bears approach this area, or the river from this area, but you can see that big long boardwalk complex. It spans a couple hundred yards up and down into the forest, and then there's another wildlife viewing platform just downstream of where this photograph was taken. So again, people walking all over this area during the daylight hours, and again, it can be an intimidating thing for a lot of those bears that just aren't used to people in close proximity. While we look at number 480 sitting in the water, and it looks like another younger bear downstream of him. This is maybe one of the first opportunities we've seen, or I've had a chance to see some close-ups of salmon on our underwater camera. And again, these are the fish that the bears are seeking. This is down at the mouth of Brooks River, so this is about a half-mile downstream of where the falls camps are located. And a lot of these fish right now will be moving into the lower Brooks River to spawn, coming up maybe in August, but definitely in September. That seems to be the peak of the salmon spawning period in Brooks River is September. So these bears are waiting for some of those fish to continue to migrate upstream. And it's actually been a fairly quiet day on the lower river right now. There's been some bears moving through this area, but down near the mouth of the river, the water level is fairly high. So it's difficult for bears to catch fish under these conditions. just like it is in the riffles, but even more so down at the mouth of the river, just because there are so many places for salmon to swim away from any bear. So a bear using this area at this time of the year really just has to look for anything that's too weak to swim away, maybe a dead or dying salmon. And that contrasts quite significantly with the scene that we have up at Brooks Falls, where where bears can afford to sit and wait for salmon to make mistakes. And we're seeing right now a lot of these younger bears getting some meals. Looks like a 717, with his front paws up on a rock. There's a bit of salmon in between that bear's hind legs. So again, indicating that this bear is fairly well fed. If these are really hungry, they can eat these fish in less than a minute. And that's, 4 to 7 pound sockeye salmon, they can put that down in their stomach in just a minute. So really ravenous bears will demonstrate that by eating their fish very quickly. But bears that are able to get a lot of food, and it seems like today is one of those days, or don't have to worry about that eating that fast. So they're going to take their time scavenging. And it looks like almost every bear in the view right now actually has a fish. So again, another good day for these younger bears. These younger bears actually may gain so much weight, they actually might double their weight from when they emerge from their dens in the springtime to when they go back into their dens in the fall. So a small subadult bear, coming out of the den, gets kicked out by its mother, is on its own at the beginning of the summer. It might not be that big, but it could easily, double its weight by the time fall comes around. And the bear that's facilitating, again, a lot of this action at the island is number 503 in the jacuzzi. Also another well-fed bear. So he's eating part of the fish, eating the brains, eating some of the skin, and then leaving the carcass behind. So he didn't actually eat very much of that fish at all. And that one is going to drift downstream and become available to one or more of these younger bears that are scavenging on the island. The one in the foreground definitely looks like a young bear, perhaps just based on its size, perhaps only 2.5 years old. So it's quite likely that this bear is on its own for the first time. There's a lot of trial and error involved in trying to survive on your own for the first time. You can imagine, being with your mother for a number of years as a small brown bear. Your mother's been your protector, your provider, your teacher, and then all of a sudden, your mother is intolerant of you. She goes into estrus. A big male starts following her. She doesn't chase that big male away. You become uncomfortable, and you decide, hey, I'm just going to happen to leave the area. So for a number of years afterwards, these young bears really do have to explore their world. It's a difficult process for them. It's a challenging process for them, but it's a stage that all successful bears have to go through before they can grow into mature adults. And we see these stories of maturation and learning and challenges every day on the bear cams. And an example of a bear who really did persevere through a lot of challenges when he was younger is this one right here, again, 503. Talked a little bit about his story at the beginning of the broadcast. But yeah, he's one of those bears that I'm very eager to follow his story into adulthood if he happens to choose to come back each and every year. And he really does have his mother's ears. So 503 is the offspring of number 402. And 402 was at the waterfall earlier today with her 4 cubs. So she actually has 4 spring cubs, or cubs of the year. And if you get a good look at both of their ears, you'll see that their ears are very crescent shaped. So that's one of the features that I look to in 503 that helps me distinguish him from some of the other bears. Right. And another fish for 503, so his catch rate is definitely picking up. So he just, I can't even tell actually if he still has that in his paws. It looked like he almost might have dropped it, but no, I think he's going back for more. Again, sometimes really well-fed bears will only take a bite or two out of the fish. It's almost like they can't turn it off. Like their instinct, their genetic makeup to catch and eat vulnerable prey is so strong that when vulnerable prey are available, they just can't turn it off. Even though their stomachs are physically full, they still try and try and try to fit more food in their belly and catch more prey. And that behavior has been described in other animals. Like in wolves, for example, biologists have described it as surplus killing. It's when vulnerable prey are available, a pack of wolves might kill more than they can physically eat, just because the prey is there and they're genetically driven to do that. Because all of these animals really live in a feast or famine world, and it's especially on display with our brown bears. Some days at Brooks Falls are not good days for fishing because there aren't many fish trying to migrate beyond the waterfall. So the bears really do have to take advantage of these opportunities as much as they can. And we can see 503 only ate part of that fish. That younger bear really hovering on the fringes, looking to move downstream as soon as it can, giving 503 a little bit of extra space, but it picked up that salmon carcass right away. So there is no waste in this ecosystem. There's very little waste among brown bears, but even if brown bears weren't scavenging all of the leftover salmon, it would be cleaned up by gulls, ravens, magpies, eagles. I even this year saw a white-crowned sparrow gathering bits of salmon flesh in its bill, probably to go feed its chicks. So it's kind of amazing to think about the cascade effects of all of these that salmon have on all of these animals. They really are the keystones of the ecosystem. It's a little bit difficult to see amongst the rocks that are in the water, but if you watch carefully, you can see some salmon swimming sort of in the channel right between the island and the near bank. Especially on days like today when the water is, or when we have the sunlight coming down at this angle, it's easier to see the salmon in the water. As the salmon turn red and they get into their spawning colors, it'll be even easier to see those fish in the water. Most of the fish that we're still seeing are not in their spawning colors, so they're not quite ready to spawn. When they reach their peak of their spawning colors, that's a visual signal to other salmon that says, "Hey, I'm ready to mate. I'm ready to compete for either nesting sites if you're a female, or I'm ready to compete for access to females if you're a male." So downstream, again, looking on the underwater camera, we see fish sort of in that transition period. We see some that are fairly silvery, but we also see quite a few that are gaining those very hooked jaws and green heads and red bodies. So they look like a much different animal compared to when they first arrive. And all Pacific salmon will go through a transition like that. They don't all have the same spawning colors. They will be different colors depending on the species. But sockeye salmon are very conspicuous and very easy to identify because they have, in their spawning colors, green heads and ruby red backs when they're fully mature fish. So all of these fish right now are going through that. You can actually see some very red ones right now. You can see some silvery ones right now. You can see some that are more maroon colored. So they're in that transition period. And there's even a few fish in there that have some white stomachs, and those are pink salmon. Those are another species of Pacific salmon. They're the smallest of the five, anadromous species that people consider to be Pacific salmon. So they're not as big as the sockeye salmon, but we do have some pink salmon moving into the Brooks River at this time of the year. And on the far side right now, looking at looks like perhaps an adult female. And this could be number 803. She was an adult female that was first identified last year. So we don't really know much at all about her life history. She actually had a yearling last year, and has since set that cub free. So presumably she weaned that cub. Now she's on her own this year, and you actually can tell that she's doing quite well this year. She has a pot belly on her. She's starting to gain a lot of fat. It's already growing in much of her new fur coat. Single female bears generally are fatter than mothers who are carrying with cubs, because mother bears really have to devote a tremendous amount of energy into raising their offspring. Their younger cubs are quite demanding in their energy needs. So a female bear may need to produce a quart of milk per cub per day. So if you have a litter of 4, like 402, that's a lot of milk that you need to produce. So bears need to draw on their energy reserves to nurse their offspring. And then one other thing that prevents them from gaining as much weight as a single female bear is the fact that they have to pay attention to what's around them more often than a single female. And those vigilance behaviors do take away from their fishing opportunities. Making sure that your cubs are safe and protected, that there are no threats approaching them or nearby, takes quite a bit of time and energy. So those two factors help to keep mothers with cubs skinnier on average than single adult bears. So if we do see some mothers on the cameras today or tomorrow, compare and contrast their size with bears like 451 or or bears that are single, I should say. So compare and contrast the mothers with bears that are single, like number 409 bead nose or 128 grazer. Those two females and this bear here, number 803, looking quite plump for this time of the year. And fatter females produce offspring at higher frequencies, and they have larger litters as well. So that is a fairly well-established trend in brown bears. So when we have bigger runs of salmon, we can generally expect the reproductive rate of brown bears to be higher. And a younger bear right now, just downstream of this female, 480 Otis, just sitting in the water, not too interested in it, and interacting with any of those bears, just resting in the water right now, which is fairly typical for him. So 803 eating her fish, and that younger bear downstream looking to scavenge. So if she leaves any of that behind, we can expect this younger bear really just to pick up the scraps as soon as it drifts away from its current owner. We're looking back upstream at the waterfall now. So from back to front, looks like number 755. And the shadow is on the far side near the rocks, kind of on that far side too. Number 801, number 39 in the water near the log, just in front of, or just behind the salmon jumping. Number 503 in the jacuzzi. And a unidentified bear here fishing in these rapids just at the base of the waterfall. This is a tough spot to fish for a lot of bears. Salmon will swim into that area trying to leap the waterfall, but the water is quite, as you can see, quite foamy there. So a lot of air in the water makes it difficult for the bears to see the salmon. And then also the other thing that makes it difficult is that not a lot of fish will swim up into that area. It only seems to be a successful spot to fish when salmon densities at the waterfall are fairly high. And when it's not a successful place to fish, bears will eventually lose their patience. They are very patient animals. I think that's one of the, and persistent animals. I think that's a couple of characteristics that you can stereotype nearly all bears with. But if they're hungry enough and one strategy isn't working, they may try to find another opportunity elsewhere. We can see the bank worn raw right now, down to dirt and rocks. That's strictly from the foot traffic of bears walking through that area. So if you need an illustration of just how many bears use this area, not only can you look in the water and see that there's a lot of bears there, but even if there were no bears in frame, you would know that there's a lot of bears that use this area just by that really wide path. That is a major highway for bears, where this one is standing right now. And we should get a look at it on our Falls Low Cam here in just a second. There it is as it walks by. The Falls Low Cam gives us a fairly unique perspective. The area on the ground at Brooks Falls is closed to people at this time of the year. So from June 15th to August 15th, you cannot be on the ground within 100 yards of Brooks Falls, upstream or downstream, and within 50 yards in that corridor along either bank. So you can't approach Brooks Falls within those distances. So this time of the year is so important for bears to fish at the waterfall. The park closes this area to people. And a lot of the rules that are in place at Brooks River to help prevent bear and human conflict aren't necessarily just for the safety of people. In fact, they're more for the welfare of the bears than anything else. So very strict regulations on food and gear storage. You can't have any food on your possession while you're at Brooks Falls, for instance. So you can only eat food in designated picnic areas or inside of buildings. You can't even carry it with you if you wanted to go watch bears at the falls. So if you get hungry, you have to plan ahead. And this helps to prevent a lot of bear and human conflicts. In fact, there hasn't been an instance where a bear has died at the hands of humans at Brooks River in over 30 years. And that is a testament to the fact that these rules work. As long as we keep food inaccessible from bears, and bears have the opportunities to live the lives of wild animals, then we can largely prevent some of the more serious bear and human conflict on the river.